Good morning. I'm Rain Jordan, the sometimes director and always volunteer of Protect Them All, which is a 501c3 animal welfare charity organization. I'm also the developer and instructor for the Fearful Dogs Projects programs and the owner of Expert Canine, which is my private behavior modification and training practice on the North Oregon coast. However, I also do provide services nationally and in some countries. I am here today, however, to talk about sheltering. I have also run a dog rescue and a dog sanctuary, so essentially a private sheltering system for quite a few years, and therefore have a decent amount of experience in the goings on, the inner workings, the background, etc., involved in rescue, sheltering, and placement. So I would like to talk with you about that today. And specifically, I would like to talk with you about the different adoption program options currently being practiced and our proposed option. Ours is called ESBA, which stands for Educational and Skills Building Adoption. Before I go into that, though, I'd like to just review a few numbers. These are some of the US sheltering trends since about 1960. There were only about 350 shelters active in the US in 1960. In the 1960s, about a quarter of the US dog population was still free roaming dogs, interestingly. There was very little money spent on pet sterilization and other preventative programs, and there is a believed correlation between those two things. In the 70s, intake and euthanasia numbers declined quite a bit. This was attributed to an increase in responsible pet ownership, as well as confinement of pet dogs to their owners' homes instead of free roaming, and to legislation, education, and pet sterilization programs. Between the 1980s and the 1990s, shelter intake declined about 50%, leveling off in the 80s, with intake and euthanasia numbers continuing to slow through the 90s. In 1970s through 2010, the dominant influence on shelter euthanasia was the declining intake of dogs into shelters. Then, from about 2009 to 2017, there was an increase in adoptions, and those represented about 25% of the total decline in euthanasia. By 2015, about 3,500 active shelters existed in the USA. The estimate is that about 95% of pets in the USA, by the way, are considered members of the family now, and about 70% actually sleep in the same beds with their human family. So we have here a pretty clear indication that pet owners, adopters, guardians, etc., are becoming more concerned about their pets as, if you don't consider them equal sentient beings, at least more concerned about them and their well-being as family members rather than just as a sort of a bleak thing that exists on the sidelines. I just want to point out here that there are some comments in the study, which is cited at the bottom of this tile, explaining the methodological problems with scientific data and research on sheltering and related topics. For example, in the 70s, there were only about 5 or 10 scientific publications on sheltering per year. And let's see, between 2010 and 2020, the frequency of these publications on animal sheltering reached about 50 per year, though only a few are focused on national or larger sheltering systems, instead focusing on 1 or 2 small shelters. So the authors of the study I've cited here feel that and have said that the data sources for sheltering and related systems vary in reliability and in comprehensiveness. Data on shelter intake and outcomes has actually never been collected and reported consistently. The numbers differ significantly between source to source, and there are several sources named in the study. But it's important to point out here what the study focuses on. One of the key factors is that none of these has succeeded in ascertaining accurate numbers on U.S. shelters or accurate intake and outcomes data of U.S. shelters. This is important because if we don't understand when we read a study about sheltering what is being covered, what the data represent, etc., then we might have a misconception of what is indicated. And as you may or may not know, other things that may affect this are the fact that some shelters handle things like surrender, returns, adoptions differently than others. For example, some shelters will, once they've placed the dog, if the dog is returned, comes back to them within a 30-day time period, they consider that and record that as a returned animal. However, if the animal comes back to them, even if returned by the owner 31 days or past, then that animal is considered a brand new intake. And so there may not be a connection made. We may not be able to follow the true complete history of dogs returned, rehomed, returned, rehomed again, etc. And this is really important in general and especially important to our ESBA program. Before I move on though, I want to point out a lovely quote from the study I've cited here. Another factor affecting the decline in intake and euthanasia numbers is the cultural shift in how pet owners relate to their pets. This cultural shift is an important factor because when we want to introduce and implement a new program that we feel is innovative and therefore may take some courage and risk in seeing through to fruition, cultural shift becomes very important, and the belief that it can be done is crucial. So let's discuss a little bit, let me present a little bit about what is going on now in the sheltering industry overall. Up until about 5 or 10 years ago, things were run a lot the way private rescues are run, with things like screening applications, home visits, a lot of pre-check and investigations. Investigations is wrong. A lot of checks to make sure that before an animal is placed that it was going to a safe place where the household members wanted the dog, the landlord allowed the dog, etc. However, over the last 5 to 10 years, open adoption has become quite popular in many shelters, and there's an active effort to continue to popularize it by promoting it wholeheartedly across the board in sheltering and rescue systems, with a lot of people actually converting to this process. This open adoption is not as accepted in responsible rescues yet as it is in shelters, but that doesn't mean it won't be. And this may or may not feel like something important to you, but in terms of the topic here today, is quite important. So I want to point out that one of the things that happened when open adoption became popular is people started to speak out against it. People who were running legitimate, responsible rescues and wanted to make sure that the animals were protected, not only in the shelter or rescue, but afterward. So as the debate continued on open adoption versus what rescues were doing, the name changed, whether this was a rebranding attempt or for whatever reason, the names changed several times. So it used to be called open adoption, was then called conversational adoption, and has even been presented as quote unquote educational adoption, which can be somewhat misleading when you learn about ESBA, you'll see why I say that. So open adoption is basically where the desires of the adopter are prioritized over any sort of screening or extra protection behaviors designed to make sure that the animal's going into a suitable home. This has been sort of put to the side in favor of making adopters happy. There's things like adopters welcome programs and advertisements. So the popular thing to do these days, becoming more popular, is to focus on keeping the adopters happy and not telling them no unless there's a clear, for example, felony animal cruelty charge on the record or something. However, since open adoption programs do not check do not run background checks, et cetera. In most cases, they kind of have to rely on the word of the adopters. And that's kind of the principle of open adoption. They do feel that they do education. I would agree. I would disagree, only because having been a college professor myself, I look at education more holistically, and needs to be done thoroughly, face to face. So some adoption organizations, rescues and shelters, perhaps don't understand that education has to be active in order to have the best chance of taking. Whereas just putting information on a website or handing an adopter a brochure or an instruction sheet or emailing them or texting them updates and check-ins is not as effective, not as thorough as actually becoming affiliated, friendly with the adopters and building a relationship with them so that you can help ensure the animal's well-being as well as the adopter's well-being and safety and other people's and animals' well-being and safety. So another thing that has been happening regarding open adoption shelters and rescues is that other terms have been used to try and convince people to get on board with open adoption. And one of those things is the claim that throwing up quote unquote barriers to adoption is a problem that we as rescue and shelter system have, and that we should stop that. Then it was pointed out that another debate began, which pointed out the positive aspects of barriers metaphorically, and as a result also in relation to sheltering. The barriers phrase was then changed to roadblocks, which made it a little harder to argue metaphorically, but nevertheless still is arguable. I'll get to that in a minute. So what we have here though on this chart, this is a very simplified chart, I realize that, trying to explain the open adoption system as it occurs in at least some shelters. So what I've done here is this is the basic process where an adopter comes in. They have a chat with the adoption counselor or somebody similar. And then in most cases, if the adopter wants to continue, that adoption is accepted. So the process happens, the paperwork, the dog is taken, and the dog is rehomed. The adopter goes home with the animal. Most of the time, as I mentioned, there's not a landlord check, a home check. Oftentimes, the adopted animal does not get to meet the other householders or other pets first. So it's just kind of based on friendliness, openness, and trust, as well as attempting to educate without pressuring to educate. And while all of these are honorable goals, they can kind of get in the way of some of the things that adopters and their animals might need to have a better chance of success long-term. I'll be covering that shortly. Anyway, so back to the chart here. After the dog is rehomed, or the cat, we have basically two ways in an open adoption system that I think it's fair to imagine those doing the placements view or might be envisioning what happens next. One possibility is over here on your, I guess that's to your left, where the placement organization and staff assume, may have to assume or may decide to assume in some cases that the animal is not kept long-term. And so down below here, we have some possibilities that would happen instead: abandonment, maybe sold, etc., or surrendered, including being given away. And another possibility, unfortunately, is that the animal has died for whatever reason. In this case, and of course, this is the darker version of what can happen and how people can think about an adoption after it's occurred. Nevertheless, these things do happen, and when they do, then they bring up new questions about all three of these possibilities. These new questions continue to sort of linger, and eventually some of these go back up here to the top, or back in the cycle, if you will, and become new requests for surrender and intake. And then, as you'll see here, I've pointed out this isn't scientifically evident. I don't know the exact number offhand of what the overall sheltering system ratio of intake to refusals is, and that's largely because, as I mentioned previously, there's not a lot of good data across the US. Anyway, so this is what happens. I view it as sort of a cyclical system wherein the less care and caution is taken when placing an animal, the more chance that animal has of being returned to the shelter or being astray and taken in by the shelter again. On the other hand, over here on the other side, if the staff of the shelter at large, assume the dog is kept, maybe they felt more confident and more comfortable with the person doing the adoption in a given case, then there are many possibilities still for an adopter who keeps the adopted animal long term. And those include things like, well, maybe the person on the dark side again. The downside might be the person maybe doesn't really like the dog, but for whatever reason decides they are going to keep it out of responsibility or guilt or whatever it might be. Another possibility is that because they don't really like the dog all that much as they thought they would, but they still don't want to return the dog, then they will tolerate the dog that is not exactly what they had in mind when they envisioned their perfect pet. Another possibility, of course, is that that disliked or tolerated dog somehow is either ignored or is gone one way or another, escaping, for example. Then we have on the lighter side, there will be some who actually like or love their pets that they've adopted and therefore keep them. And I also want to point out, though, that even when that happens, there's still so much we don't know, which is why it says "and" here. So what can happen, okay, if even in the most successful placement, if we don't stay in touch with, on a personal level, on a detailed level with the adopters, even the great ones if we think we're the very best, then we still don't know what happens while those animals live their lives out. And while to an extent that is, of course, reasonable, we don't move in with our adopters, so we're not going to know everything. The other hand is that if we don't know, then we can't offer help if something goes wrong. And as you may know, behavior problems are one of the top reasons that people return, abandon, or euthanize, electively euthanize have their dogs euthanized for like aggression, for example, or fear. We read a study today that said fear in one study was the #1 reason for surrenders of dogs. So the point here is that there are still a lot of things to consider. And when we're doing this kind of process, the open adoption process, while it's friendly and easier for adopters, it can be harder for shelters in terms of consequences, and definitely harder for animals in terms of consequences and risks. So what I put up here is how I view, comparatively to ESBA anyway, the simple open adoption process. There is minimal mutual learning. That is, while there's a conversation, it doesn't go into great detail. You don't get to learn all about each other. And therefore, not only can we not help the dog to make sure everything goes well, but we can't be supportive to the adopters if we don't know that much about them or their lives or what they want or hope in their pets, etc. In any case, so the point here is there's an attempt at some mutual back and forth, but it's fairly minimal in open adoption, comparatively. And similarly, as a result, there's zero or little true education and training that is absolutely required of the adopter. Again, the open adoption system may offer information, may give handouts, send emails, etc., but that is more of a passive learning hope. We hope if we do that the adopters will read, respond, follow those guides. And of course, as we all know, passive learning is not as powerful and effective as active approaches to learning. And as a result, we have a fairly vast uncertainty regarding outcomes in an open adoption system. Even when we assume the outcome is positive, and even when we have a very good reason to expect the outcome will be positive, there's still no way to know that. And again, that may be okay, but ideally we would be able to protect the dog lifelong. So that is why, oh, wait, gotta go here again. So here's some of the arguments against the roadblocks versus the roadblocks to adoption, which, as I said, used to be called barriers to adoption. It was argued by objectors, including myself, that barriers can actually be lifesavers, that they are positive things that serve to protect people, and metaphorically speaking, and also can serve to protect not only adopted animals, but the adopters themselves. For example, from picking a dog that wasn't a good fit, who then maybe bit out of fear or something like that. So then the barrier for word was changed to roadblocks, because it's a little, I suspect that's because it's a little bit harder to argue metaphorically that roadblocks are a good thing. However, it is still possible. For example, down at the middle here, I pointed out that while removing roadblocks will increase your traffic in the adoption center, for example, it also, removal of roadblocks increases traffic-related dangers. So you can go through here and read more about, if you're interested, how I view and ESBA views the attempt to remove all barriers and roadblocks as actual dangers rather than help. Yes, they do help in bringing more people into a shelter, because the people find it much easier to get what they want, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the best thing for the animal or for the adopters or even for citizens in the community, if we're not checking things like safety, suitability, etc. As we all know, every time there's a new context, there can be a change in behavior. So it's important to be, I feel it's important to understand each new context and try to prepare everyone as best as possible for that. Thus, I skipped. I think I added that, pardon me. Oh no, I didn't. Anyway, so thus this program, this system of open adoption, does do things that make people happy. However, it also can result in things that make people unhappy, and thus we still have lots of returns, or as we might call them, lots of intakes, new intakes to the shelter system. If anybody wants to read this, let me know and I'll send it to you. It's just too much detail to go over here. But if you want any of the information regarding open versus ESBA or anything else, just drop me a note. All right, now on to ESBA itself, educational and skills building adoption. Protect Them All in my program that we developed to try to improve upon the outcomes, likely outcomes for adopted animals and the humans involved, especially when and if we cannot get away from an open adoption system for whatever reason, and there may be good reasons. I'm not going to deny that. I might disagree. I might think there's better ways, better reasons to do other things, but nevertheless, as long as the open adoption model is popular or accepted, then we have to consider other options in addition to that, if not instead of it, to try to find other ways to protect people, their animals, and other people around. So in educational and skills building adoption, we try to focus on mutual learning and lifelong affiliation. And by that I mean, we really want to educate adopters as thoroughly as we can without keeping them for a year or something. But we want to give them the basic things that we feel that they will need, that most people who own dogs, for example, are going to need to be responsible dog owners. And then the lifelong affiliation portion of this is right here, that has to do with affiliating and becoming associated more warmly with the adopters, and not just during the adoption process or for that process, but also afterward. So that you might have, for example, you might have an appointment to talk with your adopter a few times the first month to make sure everything's okay, so that if it isn't, right away and you can do something or help them do something to modify the situation before the adopter gets frustrated, scared, etc., whatever the concern may be, and then gives up, which happens a lot, as you probably know, that by the time people call the shelter to surrender or return a dog, there's a good chance they've tolerated the issue for a long time, ignored it, maybe even tried to fix it, often, unfortunately, through things like punitive training, shock collars, prong collars, etc. All things that are not the best for the animal's welfare and can also negatively affect behavior. So it's important to have that affiliation from the start and to maintain it over the life of the dog. That's ESBA's position. In addition, we want that mutual learning to include not only us learning about the adopters, but the adopters learning about us. In addition, we want to provide as a gift, as part of the adoption process, an anti-aversives education and a bit of training. So ESBA, one of the key things about it that makes it different, and that probably also makes it a little worrisome, especially if you're nervous or risk averse or more conservative in how you do things. One of the things that makes it different is that this education and training is required as part of the adoption process. In other words, an adopter would not take home the animal until this education and training prong of the adoption process is completed. This has a lot of benefits to it. For one, the adopter gets to work with that animal in the shelter under the guidance of a shelter behaviorist or behavior consultant or trainer, depending on the dog and the person. And during that process, there's a back and forth, there's more true mutual learning and more true conversation to ensure that it's a good fit, that the adopter is comfortable using anti-aversive methods versus punitive methods, for example, and that the adopter actually has the desire as well as the ability to implement these practices. So down here we have data gathering, mutual learning. So here we consider also, as I mentioned, mutual learning is partially data gathering, learning about the situation that the animal requested would be moving into, learning about what the hopes are of the animal in the people who live there. If you know you want a dog who's super friendly, for example, and just loves everybody right away, then it would not be wise to adopt out a dog who has a tendency toward fearfulness of humans or avoidant behavior to be placed with somebody in an open adoption system just because they like that particular dog, even though when they get home, the others might not like that dog. So this whole process here at the top is interested in trying to head off any of those issues before they begin, and therefore to have a better chance of ensuring that the adoption actually is quote unquote forever. That is a lifelong relationship between the dog or the cat and the household. And you'll notice here this says the vast concern and vast capacity. These are two key elements, important elements for what we call lifelong life-saving. And what is meant by lifelong life-saving is that it's the idea that it's just not about rescue and rehoming. That is the initial life-saving in many cases, or in some cases, to rescue the dog and then or the cat and find them a new home. However, if the new home also isn't a good fit, if the people use punitive handling, if the landlord doesn't allow the dog and so the dog has to go, all kinds of things can happen here that would the result would be that life-saving has not yet been achieved. So from our perspective, from ESBA's perspective, life-saving is only confirmed over a long period of time after adoption. And if you want to get really exacting about it, then life-saving must be lifelong. That is, we have to try to ensure as best we can that the positives of the placement last throughout the dog's life in the home. So back to the process. So here in ESBA, the top two things we do are data gathering, mutual learning, and then meet and greets, not only with the adopter and the dog, but ideally with the household members so that there can be a relationship built there as well, so that they all feel comfortable talking with us, feel comfortable with the adoption process, the animal, etc., and therefore will feel more comfortable in asking for help as soon as they need it. It's also important because if you have maybe one person in the house has been taught to use a shock collar on dogs, and your adopter has been taught otherwise, then you can be the mediator instead of them having to argue it out for themselves. And oftentimes people don't want to do that, so they just, let whatever happens, depending on the personalities. From there, we go to the next level, which is once the affiliation and meet and greets have been done, we begin the education and training process, the anti-aversives education, that is humane training. So what we recommend is taught to the adopters, kinesthetically, by the way, the adopters actually do the processes themselves, is things like R+, positive reinforcement training, DCC, that is desensitization and counter conditioning, maybe even some cooperative care and handling depending on the situation. And in general, we're looking to help promote and help the adopters achieve what I call an anti-aversive lifestyle. That is, the dog has a pleasant as a life as possible. And that's achieved by training, humane training and conditioning, and a focus on avoiding aversives and instead offering positive solutions. So this would be done with a staff trainer in the shelter or rescue, and then with the dogs as well under that staff trainer or coaching. So the adopters will be taught the material, explain the material, and then they will begin practicing it with the staff trainer or behavior consultant and the dogs. From there, once that's achieved, and of course this is going to be different for each shelter in need, how much you do, how long it takes, etc. That adjusts as needed. But what we're looking for here is to achieve a capacity to provide the dog a humane lifestyle, as well as the commitment confirmation from the adopter that yes, I like what I've learned, I understand it, I'm willing to do it, and etc. And so if we get that capacity and commitment confirmation from the adopter, then we go down here and the adoption goes forth. If we do not get that commitment, let's say that the adopter says, heck no, I don't want to do that. I went through this to make you happy, but I'm not going to do any of it. Then you have to make a choice. Do you want to just take the risk and adopt anyway, or do you want to go back and try again? Just as in behavior analysis and behavior modification, we go back and try again if it doesn't work the first time, rather than escalating. The recommendation would be to do the same thing in ASBA. So if you can't get capacity and confirmation first time around, you offer it again. This means you have to be creative, more enticing ways to achieve this. Eventually, ideally, we get through all of this. The adopter builds capacity and has a commitment to maintain it. And then the adoption proceeds. From here, it's actually fairly easy, although it might look like a lot, might look like too much to some people. Once the dog is placed, since we've already built a relationship with the adopter and hopefully also with the other members of the household, now we can regularly recheck with them, and we don't have to be scared to actually call them on the phone or ask for, have lunch or whatever it is. I know that's not going to happen in a big shelter, but like I said, to each his own needs. So in any way we recheck, we make that recheck personal. And this way we can, again, try to ward off any problems that might be building that the adopter doesn't realize yet before they happen. And therefore to keep that bond between the dog or the cat and the family intact, rather than letting it be chipped away at by increasing problems over time. So we do a recheck. If all is well, then we want to make sure and reinforce that, of course, reinforce the adopters for doing a great job so that they keep doing a great job. If in our recheck we find that assistance is needed, then we go back and we provide that assistance in whatever way that means for the given organization. And then we recheck again. So this is kind of a loop. We keep doing this until we get stability and everyone's happy and comfortable. And by everyone, I mean, of course, the adopters and the dog or cat as well. So once we get there, again, we reinforce generously, and then we repeat this process over time regularly. If the dog is in the home for a year, you might decide to check in every few months. If the dog has been in the home for 5 or 10 years, you might think, okay, I don't need to check in every few months anymore. But the point here is whatever you deem is best to help the adopters remain happy with their pet, and for the pet to remain happy, healthy, and safe is what the time increments you would choose. So that is it in terms of the basics. You will notice I still left down the bottoms and the tops. There's still the fact that we still never know for sure. Of course, nothing is guaranteed ever. But these concerns become much less. They fade into the background more when we are being more proactive in our animal welfare efforts. And so again, yes, we'll still have intake requests, but the difference here with ESBA is that you have some choices. It doesn't have to be just a matter of no, we can't take your animal, or yes, we can, goodbye. But here, if you may take an animal and start providing ESBA in terms of the ESB portion, and then provide the full ESBA upon adoption. Whereas the animals that don't get taken in, you can still provide education and skill building to those people. And I feel like that is part of our responsibility to the community and to the animals of our community in general. If we are running an animal welfare organization whose charter it is to shelter, rescue, and protect animals. Okay, so there's some stuff over here that on the text side that explains that the ESBA's program is sort of a win-win-win-win solution. Everybody benefits. The adopters benefit. The placement organization benefits. The general public benefits. And of course, well, yeah. So I've gone over just a few of those how they benefit. So the likelihood of the new home being forever is a huge benefit for the animal, of course. The likelihood that the adopter will remain happy with the animal, huge benefit for everybody, for the adopter, for the animal, for us as professionals in animal welfare, and for the community at large, because when there's a good relationship between the adopter and the animal, and it's built on humane handling and treatment, that is much less likely to be an animal who has behavior issues that will upset others in the community. And then there's the likelihood that the shelter will enjoy increased respect in the community, along with increased time, space, and satisfaction of the staff. This may seem counterintuitive, since if you're doing more before you place an animal, you might feel like you're not going to have space. But in reality, once we get the system rolling, it also logically makes sense that as adopters become better with their animals and how to keep themselves and their animals happy and well, then shelter intake requests will decrease, and that will be a more permanent result, because just as bad behavior can tend to, there could be a contagion. The same is true of good behavior, not only in our animals, but in our own behavior as well. And then as a result, we have that increased public safety likelihood. Let's see. So here again, I'm thinking, how much time? I don't know how long I've been going. So this is the general culture that we're looking to achieve with ESBA. So we have everything is built on culture, of course, as I talked about in the beginning. And that includes the community, it includes capital, that is money to make it keep running. So in the community, we want to bring in experts, innovators, advocates, and learners, of course, our adopters and others in the community who want to learn, need to learn how to help their animals. On the capital side, we want to include encouraging courage, generosity, of course, support, and public relations, all of these in a supportive way by people who are willing to take a little risk, be brave, try new things, and try them for the sake of the animals and the adopters of those animals. Down here we have intake and intake diversion. We've already talked about that. So ESBA can be involved in both of those and would become a big part of it actually. Intakes will eventually go down, which will result, of course, in more capacity for care in the shelter system. And then over here, the big thing for us is, since our name is Protect Them All, that's probably obvious, protection of the animals as well as the people involved with the animals. And that requires responsible rehoming. Under all of these these sections of the chart are some more detailed explanations. I'll just flip through so you can see them closer up. I don't want to read them to you. You would get very bored. But if you're interested in reading the details of each of these, again, let me know, and I can send you copies of the slides. Just let me know which ones you want. And if you have any other questions about those claims on the slides and charts, please do let me know that. I would love to have a conversation with you about that. So here we go through capital and the details about things supporting capital, intake and intake diversion, details about responsible rehoming. We kind of covered that already. So the ultimate goal here is the lifelong life saving. And from ESBA, the point of ESBA is to encourage and achieve lifelong life saving, which of course means well-being for everyone. So that is the ultimate goal of ESBA. There's a lot to do to get there, but it is quite possible. I know it's possible. I've done it myself, and I know it can be hard and take some resources, but as with anything new, that's what happens at the beginning. It does get better and easier over time. So let's see. So again, this is from Protect Them All, and we have a couple of little slogans I'd like to share, and one of them is to point out that when we say we love our animals, we have to remember that love, a real love, is a combination of not only being kind, but being responsible. So love and Protect Them All's view equals kindness plus responsibility. There's also a saying you may have heard or seen on our website that is responsibility, that those who want to be great must be responsible. That is, you don't get greatness without achieving responsibility. That's it for this. Let's see. That's it for this presentation. I'm going to pause it for a few minutes and answer any questions you have in the comments. And then we'll go next to, if not today, today. If not right away, then in about an hour to the next presentation. So I look forward to your questions and comments and to responding in kind. Thanks for saying.